Okay, so not long ago, someone left a comment under my Jane Eyre video that kind of stopped me in my tracks. Gracina3 wrote, "As a person with ADHD, the portrayal of Helen Burns in Jane Eyre is possibly the most accurate portrayal of a woman with ADHD I have ever read in any media." At first I thought this was a clever, modern reading of a Victorian character, but the more I thought about this comment, the more it kind of lingered in my mind. Because there is something about Helen's dreamy abstraction, her moral intensity, her quiet otherworldliness that is kind of uncannily familiar, like someone who lives slightly out of step with everyone else's tempo. And it made me wonder, what if a neurodivergent reading of the classics can open up a new way of understanding these books? So in this video, I want to explore that question, not by diagnosing fictional characters, but by using modern ideas about neurodivergence to reread the classics. We're going to look at 4 characters that have been read and reread for generations, but who I think can be given a fresh new angle through a neurodivergent reading. As it turns out, there's been quite a lot of scholarly work done in this area, and I think you'll find it fascinating. There'll be links in the description to everything that we reference. So, the funny thing about being diagnosed neurodivergent in adulthood is you're always the last one to know. This video is personal for me. When I found out in my early 50s that I am autistic, I was shocked and surprised and relieved all at the same time. It felt like an enormous explanatory book had opened up, and I could see a whole new narrative and context to my life that I just didn't know was there. And making this video, rereading these characters through the lens of neurodivergence, has shown me that not only is there more than one way to be human, there's also more than one way to read these books. So let's make a start with Helen Burns from Jane Eyre. Helen was Jane's childhood friend at the terrible, brutal orphanage school Lowood. And Helen is really the only person in the entire novel to show Jane genuine friendship. She's one of the most intriguing characters in the novel, a girl of enormous inner life. Withdrawn yet also luminous, her head is always in the clouds or perhaps in the heavens. She's forgetful of small but important Lowood rules, yet she's also capable of intense moral focus. She doesn't follow rules easily, and she frustrates authority with her absent-mindedness. But when she believes in something, she clings to it with a kind of radiant obsession. If we borrow today's language, we might say that Helen Burns displays the kind of traits that we would associate with ADHD. We obviously can't say this in a clinical sense, but in her pattern of attention, easily distracted by trivia, yet profoundly absorbed by ideas that grip her imagination. Her mind doesn't move in straight lines, it moves in leaps, in associations and intuitions. Charlotte Brontë, who wrote the novel, of course, didn't have the vocabulary that we have today about neurodivergence, but she understood difference. Because Helen processes the world inwardly in long chains of thought invisible to others. And when Jane looks at her, she's both inspired and puzzled. Through their friendship, Brontë explores 2 different minds in dialogue. Jane's fiery impulsiveness and Helen Burns' drifting contemplation. And in that contrast, Brontë gives us something timeless, the way that literature can give space to minds that don't fit the expected mold.
Once I had a secret.
The central love story in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice between Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet begins when he refuses to dance with her in an unfamiliar setting. His explanation to Elizabeth is that "I detest it unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner." And both Elizabeth and Fitzwilliam interpret his behavior, as many generations have done, is kind of an aloofness characteristic of aristocratic pride. But Austen scholar Mikkel Deckel asks in his paper on Darcy and autism, what if we read Darcy's own explanation and take him at his word? Darcy himself says, "I certainly have not the talent which some people possess of conversing easily with those I have never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done. This is my Helen Burns moment, because this is the most accurate portrayal of autism that I have read. This is me, my experience of social engagement. So Gracina 3, thank you for your insightful comment. I think I know how you felt when you read Helen Burns. Darcy's refusal to dance, his tactless refusal of Elizabeth, and his literal interpretations of irony all indicate a communication rigidity and social unawareness typical of someone on the autistic spectrum. When read this way, Austen's novel becomes a study of different types of cognition and empathy. Deckel's paper argues that Pride and Prejudice anticipates contemporary understandings of the spectrum, suggesting that the novel implicitly explores the diversity of human minds. For Deckel, Darcy embodies the logical, rigid, detached aspects of autism, while Elizabeth Bennet represents the empathetic, the socially perceptive, the emotionally intelligent aspects of neurotypicality. The novel isn't just a clash of pride and prejudice. It's a meeting of two different neurological worlds. Elizabeth becomes, in a sense, Darcy's emotional educator, and I have one of those too. She guides him towards empathy, connection, and social understanding. Reading Darcy as autistic doesn't erase Austen's satire of class and gender, but it adds another layer to it. His aristocratic privilege only conceals or cushions his social limitations. Through Elizabeth, he grows into a fuller humanity, not by changing who he is, but by broadening his understanding of social cues. When read this way, Pride and Prejudice becomes a story of social redemption. Mr. Darcy's journey isn't just the story of a proud man humbled by love. It's the story of one type of mind learning to meet another. So as I said, I've added a link to Deckel's paper in the description, and I've also added a link to the brilliant website literary.neurodivergency.org, which has a great database of the many studies and papers that have been done in this field, including some fascinating work on the courtly jester in Shakespeare. I think Mr. Darcy may have recognised in Victor Frankenstein some shared traits. Victor is notoriously obsessive, hyper-focused, and detached from human feeling. Victor's main problem is excess of focus. He retreats from the world in a self-acknowledged way, consumed by his single idea of creating the creature. He loses all sense of proportion, of social cues, and of empathy. Read today, we might see in Victor traits associated with autism spectrum conditions. His difficulty in interpreting emotions, his literalism, and his absorption and fixation on systems and patterns. Once committed to his endeavours, he ignores family and loved ones, even though he is very deeply in love with Elizabeth and holds his friend Clerval very dear to his heart. He denies himself of them, effectively cutting them off, not with malice or spite, but with a hyper-fixation on his personal mission. Julia Miele Rodas has written a great study on autism in Frankenstein, again link in description. She argues that the romantic literary voice and the autistic voice share some common features. Long reflective monologues, isolation, a longing to connect, and communication that fails or is troubled. To her, Mary Shelley's novel prefigures or embodies a neurodivergent romantic aesthetic. So I recently reread Frankenstein for my video essay on it, and reading it after my own autism diagnosis was a very different experience. Because I also have my own obsessions, and I can easily lose track of people that I care about. This is not to say that every fictional character who obsesses or can be socially awkward should be boxed as autistic, but it is an interesting experience to recognize patterns of behavior and thinking in the context of my own experience. I don't like Victor, I don't think I'd like him in real life, but I do recognise his inner world. What Shelley gives us in Victor Frankenstein is the portrait of a mind in a closed loop. He's brilliant, he's creative, but he's unable to connect with others. What's so brilliant about this portrayal of Victor is that he genuinely cares about his loved ones. He regrets and feels bad about cutting them off, and his feeling for them isn't shallow or superficial. He's just so wrapped up in his special project that he forgets to eat, to sleep, and to keep in contact with the ones he loves. And what's fascinating about the novel is that Shelley pairs Victor with his exact opposite, the creature, who is often remembered now as an unfeeling, monstrous automaton, but who in the novel is actually overflowing with feeling and empathy as well as rage and revenge. The creature feels and notices everything. The warmth of the sun, the coolness of the moon-filled waters of the forest, the cruelty of rejection, the music of language, and the consideration and hard work displayed by the de Lacys. If Victor is hyper-rational, looking inward to the exclusion of the outside world, the creature is hypersensitive, looking outward at the world and others. Between them, Shelley stages a dialogue about different forms of cognition, the mind that overanalyzes and the mind that overfeels. Each suffers from an imbalance, and each actually needs each other's mode of understanding. It's striking to me how Frankenstein anticipates what we now call neurodiversity. Not a hierarchy of minds, but a tragic disconnection between them. Victor Frankenstein gave up his friends and family for his obsession, which turns out to be the very thing that the creature craves: social connection, companionship, and love. Okay, before we get to the last character, I would love you to tell me in the comments your response to this idea. Which neurodiverse characters have you read and noticed? If you're neurodiverse yourself, have they connected with you? Have they explained your inner experience in a way that is striking? If you're neurotypical, do these readings help you to understand neurodivergence? Please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Okay, another character that kind of seems out of step with the world is Dorothea Brooke from Middlemarch. If you don't know the story, Dorothea Brooke is the kind of heroine of George Eliot's Middlemarch. She's idealistic, intelligent, and deeply moral, and the life of this young woman becomes a kind of study of frustrated aspiration. Dorothea longs to live for purpose. She wants to do good, to serve others, and to dedicate herself to something larger than just social conventions. At the start of the novel, her spiritual intensity and her naive idealism lead her to marry the much older scholar Edward Casaubon. She believes that his intellectual work will give her life meaning. Instead, she finds herself desperately trapped in a cold, loveless, and controlling marriage. Dorothea's story traces her gradual awakening from the starting point of her kind of intense moral idealism, and by the end she learns that true moral worth often does not lie in the grand gestures, but more in the everyday influence of empathy, patience, and integrity. After Casaubon's death, she forgoes her inheritance by marrying the disinherited cousin, Will Ladislaw. George Eliot describes Dorothea as a creature too large for the surrounding circumstances of her life. Dorothea feels everything deeply. She seeks moral clarity, yet struggles with social nuance. Her intensity tends to alienate others. Her ideals make her kind of awkward in polite society. As modern readers, we might sense some aspects of the autistic spectrum in Dorothea: her black and white thinking, her passionate focus, and a painful self-consciousness about misunderstanding other people. But, crucially, Eliot, the author of Middlemarch, never ridicules her. She writes Dorothea as a moral visionary whose mind refuses to settle for the smallness of the world around her. Eliot, who studied both psychology and philosophy, seem to intuit that different minds perceive moral reality with a different texture of clarity. And in giving Dorothea space to think and to err, she dignifies that difference. The very intensity that isolates Dorothea in the book is also a source of her moral insight. Through her, I think Eliot shows us that far from being mental flaws, neurodivergence actually opens doors to different ways of perceiving. When we read these characters together, Helen Burns, Darcy, Victor Frankenstein, and Dorothea Brooke, a pattern emerges. Each occupies a liminal space between worlds, between chaos and focus, between rationality and emotion, and between connection and solitude. Long before modern psychology, novelists were already exploring what it means to experience the world differently. These incredible and difficult novels are a record of their thoughts about how people function. They don't use diagnostic language, but instead they use metaphor, story, and voice. And in doing so, I think they give us something that science rarely can: the inner texture of lived difference. They put us in the sometimes uncomfortable position of sitting in their place, walking in their shoes, feeling and seeing the world as they do. And maybe that's why readers of today find themselves reflected in these great characters. Of course, I'm aware there's a risk here. It's easy to project modern categories onto the past and diagnose fictional characters, people who existed long before our psychological frameworks. But these writers were already describing neurological variety without the need to pathologize it. Their insight is humanistic, not medical. When a modern reader says Helen Burns has ADHD, they're not reducing her. They're just recognizing themselves. I think it's more of an act of identification, not diagnosis. And to me, that reveals how enduringly literature can capture the diversity of minds, not as conditions, but as ways of being human. So perhaps the question isn't whether these characters are neurodivergent, but whether literature has always been the home of neurodivergent imaginations. As modern readers, we can bring new ways of seeing to the page, finally recognizing patterns of attention, perception, and emotion that writers have been describing for centuries. The Brontës, Shelley, Eliot, and Austen all wrote from the edges of convention, giving voice to difference before society had names for it. Their characters often think too much, feel too much, and dream too much. And in them, we find not disorder, but depth, a kind of reflection of humanity that just rings true. Neurodivergent modes of expression are not simply marginal, but maybe essential and central to our literary tradition. Okay, if you liked this video, don't be shy, come and subscribe. I put out videos every week. If you have anything that you'd like to share with me in the comments, please do so. I'll see you there, and I'll see you next week for another episode. Thanks for watching.